Hi all, this side Anup here, and I would like to welcome Mr. Govind, who is a very vibrant speaker. Welcome, Govind. And Govind is a chartered accountant and has a overall 5+ years of post qualification experience in risk related sectors, and his primary focus on leveraging data analytic techniques and tools for risk profiling and continuous monitoring. The nature of industry he has served includes banking and financial service, pharmaceuticals, logistics, FMCG, technology, manufacturing, and including both industry and retail manufacturing and infrastructure and construction. So hope all of you will have a very interactive session, and wishing all a happy learning session. Over to you, Govind.
Yeah, thank you, Anu, for that introduction. So could you confirm if I'm audible?
Yes, you are audible.
All right. Thank you. And thank you for that introduction, Anu. Uh, Welcome all to the session on Excel, advanced Excel using VBA macros. So in this section, our focus would be on Excel macros. So like how the kind of background that I put behind me, our idea is to cut open Excel and figure out how we can play around with it. So the Excel VBA macro base fundamentally gives you this ability to touch point different aspects of Excel, which sometimes a normal user might not be able to access from the front end. And that's what a VBA macro is supposed to do. In this session, we won't be having any slides or presentation. We'll be directly getting into Excel and trying to get our hands dirty. We would have a bunch of examples that we would go through. I'd be coding, and I would urge the listeners or the attendees to interrupt me anytime uh, you would like to, and ask questions or whatever doubts that you have while you go through the session. Since this is a coding session, as we are playing around with VBA, there is a high chance or probability that you might get stuck somewhere, or you might not really understand why might be doing certain things. If I'm not being clear at any point, please feel free to interrupt me at that point and ask your queries. With that being said, let me share my screen and get along with our presentation. So I'll be sharing my screen now. Is my screen visible?
Yes, Govind, your screen is visible.
Yes, sir.
All right. So kicking off, Excel has a VBA layer in it. So VBA stands for Visual Basic for Applications. So it's a programming language that is specifically designed for accessing certain features in their application through a programming interface. Please do mind that VBA is not the language in which Excel was ever written. It's just an extensible language that is built as a fundamental core to Excel itself, which users can access so that they can access all the features of Excel through the backend. So you might ask why, or what's the reason for having such a feature in Excel anyways? If something can be accessed from the front end, why do you need an access from, say, a programming layer? To answer that question, you need to, first of all, understand the kind of problems that we might face with Excel. Excel being a GUI tool, anything that you need to do in Excel either should be keyed through a keyboard or passed on as shortcut commands in a keyboard, or through mouse clicks and drops and drags and all of that. If you want to repeat a certain task, then you might have to do that task those many number of times using a front-end interface by clicking, dragging, and dropping. The Excel VBA gives you this ability to code that and then run it again and again as much as you want, so that such kind of task where you need to repeatedly do a certain thing can be automated. Second is that Visual Basic for Applications rests on the .NET framework, and the .NET framework in a Microsoft environment, say if you have the Office suite, that means your Word, your Excel, your PowerPoint. VB environment gives you this ability for Excel to communicate with all of these applications together. So from Excel, you might be able to call Word and do something. So as an example, say you want a table to be converted as a certain kind of a text in a Word document and say the Word document in VBA, it is possible. It's that example is kind of a difficult task, but still it is possible. You can even access the operating system lab. So you might be able to control many aspects of the fundamental operating system itself from the VB environment. So having these possibilities in Excel greatly enhances the ability for you to automate the Excel layer. Currently, in our scenario, your robotic process automation and things of that sort are gaining momentum. But even when you have an RPA layer working, the macro still gives you an ability to access certain things from the backend, which is many a times more efficient and more robust compared to automating certain things from the RPA interface. So in certain specific examples, this is much better than, say, going on a fully blown RPA development. And that's the reason why this becomes a lot important, especially when this is the time and age for process automations. Excel macros can be integrated with RPA to bring in a lot more efficiency. And that's another reason to actually believe that this is still a great place to learn and understand, even in our current scenario. So with that being said, let's first get into understanding the interface and where the developer resides in an Excel environment. So in the Excel screen that you're seeing right now, most of you might not have the developer tab already there. So the developer tab is more or less hidden. I do have the developer tab here at the top, but most of you might not have this tab enabled. So if you do not have the tab enabled, then what you need to do is you need to go to options in Excel and then go to ribbon, customize ribbon. And in that ribbon, you need to tick on developer. This usually would be unticked for most of the standard distributions of Excel. So you'll have to tick this and then click on OK. Once this is done, you would start seeing the Excel developer ribbon appearing in your screens. Once the ribbon is enabled, then what you need to do is get into developer, go to Visual Basic, the one to the left, and then click on Visual Basic. This would then open up another interface, which let me bring in. Anup, is my VBA screen also visible?
Hello, sir.
Is my VBA screen visible as in a is a
Yeah,
bunch? Yeah.
your Excel macros is showing, sir. That coding window is showing right now.
Oh, all right. Perfect. I just want to confirm. All right. So this is the interface that you would get once you click on the developer tab and on the Visual Basic button. So once you're there, you start seeing a bunch of codes. So if your Excel has already been expanded and some people have gone ahead and developed something, then you might be able to see a bunch of codes written there. So obviously mine has already been expanded, so some code is already there. But if not, then you would be somewhere here. So you would have your workbook name here, your VBA project, and the name of the workbook would be present there. And to start coding, you'll have to open a module where you code your Excel VBA. To do that, you'll have to right click on the VBA project and then go to insert and then click on module. This would then open up a folder called modules and then bring up module 1. And then we get on to the coding interface. So this is the typical coding interface that you have. It's not the usual, the coder's interface with black background and all that. It's a very simple white interface, but there are certain ways you can customize this as well, but we won't be getting deeper into those aspects because the overall objective of this training session is for you to understand how to code and how to get along with certain examples. So in a macro coding environment, there are fundamentally two things that you can write. One is a code snippet, which starts with something called as a sub, SUB. And you can also write and expand on creating your own functions. By the name functions, what it refers to is the, say you have your equal to sum, which is a function. These are functions that Microsoft has already defined in the standard distribution of Excel. While you Microsoft gives you this ability to code your own custom functions. Say if you want to achieve something that Excel doesn't have a function for. Say you need a function to extract numbers from a string with text and numbers in it. In a VBA setup, you can write a code for that and make it as a function and then have the function work inside the Excel itself. That's one way you can expand using the VBA. Another way you can expand using the VBA would be writing a sub, which is basically a code snippet that does the automation, the one where you might see magically cursors moving around and the Excel shaking and suddenly certain things happening to the Excel sheet. That's what a code snippet does. So how to start with? Let's start with a usual code snippet and start with the fundamental hello world, which everybody starts with. I mean, all coders should fundamentally start with a hello world snippet. So let's start with our traditional hello world snippet. So our first code, the objective is to basically pop a window in your screen that says hello world. That's what we are trying to do. So to do that, first you would write SUB. Then let's say we have to name the code that you are writing. So I'm going to name it as HW, standing for hello world. And once that, you just put a open and closing brackets, you close it, and then you press the enter key. Once you do that, the end sub also be created. So whatever you write between sub and end sub is fundamentally the code that does the automation. And then for readability, I usually do the tabbing of how my code appears. So I usually, align it using a tab. It improves readability of code. And then you would write MSG BOX, standing for message box. Oh, sorry. And then you would open brackets, and then within quotes, you would write hello world, whatever that you want the pop out to show out. Close the curly, the double quotes, and then closing the brackets. So this is the kind of code snippet that you would write. And once you write the code snippet, the way you run it is by clicking on the play button that you see here. So once you have written this, press the play button, and you would see that Microsoft Excel has popped out a screen which basically says hello world. So this is how you would basically write a piece of code. So objective of this was to just demonstrate this is how the backend works, and this is how you might maybe write a message box and pop something out. Now let's try to put the same hello world into a certain cell in an Excel sheet. So to understand that, you need to first understand that Excel encapsulates the whole idea of a workbook to a cell in a certain way. The hierarchy is such that there is a workbook, and inside a workbook, there are sheets, and inside sheets, there are ranges, and inside ranges, there is a cell. So that's the hierarchy that is followed. Workbooks, sheets, ranges, cells. So to call a certain cell and insert a certain message to it, you would fundamentally would have to call the workbook, the sheet, the cell, and then insert the value to it. And that's the only way you can tell VBA to insert it in a certain specific cell. So in the current scenario, my idea is to insert hello world into cell A1 of my active workbook or the active sheet. So how would you then call an active workbook or an active sheet? So what I would do is I would type active active workbook dot active sheet. So I'm trying to call the active sheet in the active workbook and dot range. And inside range, I'm going to specify the cell I want to select, which is going to be within quotes A1 and quotes close, bracket close. And then inside range, when you talk of a cell in Excel, a cell itself can have a multitude of attributes. And one among those attributes is the value that the cell holds. So a cell can hold a value, the cell can hold a formula, the cell can hold formatting information of how the cell should be formatted, the background color, the font, the boldness of the font, everything. So of all the attributes that a cell range can have, the one that you want would be the value. So then you'll be calling value. Then for value, you would give an equal to, and then whatever you want it to have, in our case, is hello world. Deleting the message box. And now let's once more have a look on our workbook. The workbook currently is blank at A1. I'm running the snippet. And then I'm going back to my workbook and I can see that the hello world has been placed where I wanted it to. So now with this, you would have understood how to put in a snippet and basically key in a certain value. As I said before, if anybody is stuck somewhere, please feel free to interrupt me and ask your questions. If everybody is clear till this point, let's then get into slightly more interesting aspects of VBA. So the reasons why VBA becomes great options for automation is its ability to handle loops. So you can fundamentally define loops like how you define in most of the coding environments. And once you have a loop, the loop then allows you to automate things umpty number of times, the number of times that you need to define loop for. And that's the fundamental concept that helps VBA developers automate many things in the VBA environment. So now let's take a pretty simple example. So the example that we are going to take right now would be the example of putting in numbers from 1 to 10 from the first cell to the bottom. So that's the example that we are trying to develop here. So let's go back to the workbook. So my idea, or what I'm trying to achieve, is to basically have 1 to 10 be put in cells from A1 to A10 by using a code snippet, somewhat like this. This is what I'm trying to achieve, not here, but in the VB environment. And with this, we'll be trying to understand how loops work. So there are not one, but many types of loops in the Excel VBA. So you have the for next new loop, the do while loop, and for each loop. They have multiple loops in VBA. And it depends on the kind of loop that you're using for the loop that you want to choose, depends on the scenario that you have. So let's say the scenario that you have is inserting numbers from 1 to 10. So going back to a coding environment, what I would fundamentally do now is I would I would first reference the cell A1. So to do that, I would first initialize a variable that would point to a certain cell that I want to insert a value to. So I'm going to call this as cell. So to initiate that, what the code that you would write is set, then the name of the variable, in our case, which is cell, I'm calling it as cell, equal to active sheet dot range, and then A1 being the location where I want to start from. So now I have defined a variable that is cell, and the cell is now pointing to A1. All right, that is in your workbook. I'm pointing it to this part of the workbook. Yeah. So once this pointing is done, now what I want to do would be to iterate from 1 to 10. So to iterate from 1 to 10, what I would use is something called as a from to loop. So for that, you would write for I equal to 1 to 10. So this is the loop that I'm going to create, use for. So what this loop means is it's basically telling the system to take a variable called I, the I to have values from 1 to 10. So every time the loop runs, that is the loop between whatever code that is there between for and next, whenever this code runs, the i's value will move from 1 to 10. Every time the loop goes in, it starts with 1, and once the loop ends, it then goes to 2, then goes to 3, then goes to 4, and so on until it reaches 10. So for that, you write for I is equal to 1 to 10. And the things that you want to do while you iterate would then be written in between for and next. So next is when the system moves from one value to the other, as in from 1 to 2, 2 to 3, and so on. So in between these, I would now write the code to put values into our cell. So now I would write CELL, which is the variable that I have defined before, dot value. I can call in value because cell is currently a range. As we have defined it here, the cell is currently a range. So I would then call the value attribute of a cell. And then we would define that as our I. And once I've inserted value into the cells, my objective would be to then move the cursor from A1 to A2, because I'll have to move from one row to the next. So to do that, what I would do is now move the cursor from A1 to A2. And for that, we have a function called offset. So now I would say set cell equal to cell dot offset. So offset basically, as the name refers, that's a function that is used to move our selection or a cursor from one to the other. And offset always is defined as rows and columns. So in offset, two variables can be supplied. The first is for the movement in rows, and the second is for movement in columns. So for that, offset, row offset of 1 and column offset of 0, because you don't want the cell to move from left to right. And we would close the brackets. This would enable it to move from one cell to the other. And then that's the code that you would want. And once this is written, we can run this and we can see the result. So now in my sheet, there's nothing. I'm running the snippet. And you can see that it is inserted from 1 to 10. Now to understand offsets further, let's try to kind of change it a bit. Let's try to advance it a bit. So what would happen if I put 1 here? Now you would understand how an offset really works. I'm deleting it, or let's keep it. Let's see how it works on top of it. And now let's run this code and see how this would give you the result. See, every time since I put 1 and 1, every time an offset was made, a row and a column offset was done. So the cursor moved down and then to the right. And that's the reason why now you have it as a diagonal. So this is how an offset works. The first number that you give would be the row offset, and the second number that you give would be the column offset. So since we have achieved this idea of moving from 1 to 10. Let's now do something else. Let's now create or expand on whatever we have written, or maybe create another snippet that can now move from one value to the other in an entire Excel sheet. So in this Excel sheet, if I have numbers from A1 to say till an X cell, let's say, what I want my code to do is I want my code to move from one cell to the other, understand what the value is, and come up with something about it. Say, let's say my idea is to take each cell and then add it by one and write a number to the right side. Let's say that's the kind of code that I'm trying to write. So for that, let's now generate a bunch of random numbers and do it, just so that we'll have some more fun with it. So I'm going to currently generate a bunch of random numbers. Okay, now I've generated a bunch of random numbers. Paste the values also. So now my objective is for the code to move from one cell to the other and then add one to it and put the value in, say, the row to the right. If that's the code that we are trying to write, let's figure out how to write that. So in such a situation, in the situation that we have right now defined, the problem is Excel doesn't know when my numbers are starting and when my numbers are ending. This is a typical scenario that you would usually face while you code in the VB environment. You don't know where your data lies. There are many ways of getting it, but usually the foolproof way of doing it is to iterate through a certain row so that whenever there is a value in that row, you end up doing some activity for the entire row itself. So the code would end when there's no value in that row. Defining a code of that sort is much better than you're taking many other directions in Excel. There are many other ways of doing it. But the best way so far that I have at least experienced so far is to iterate through that row to understand the last cell where there is a value and then iterate through it. So to do that, let's call this code as sub increment. So for this, you will have to first place your cursor in A1 because that's where you're going to start. And then you would then write a loop that would see if the cell is blank. So until the cell value is blank, you want the code to move forward. So for that, you write something called do while. So do cell dot offset 1,0 dot value is equal to blank. So to explain this code snippet, the do while basically tells the system to do the task that is written between the do while loop until the system incurs a blank value for the offset of 10 to cell to whatever cell that we have defined. That's the code that we have written. So what that means is it iterates through each cell, and every time the code iterates through each cell, it sees if the cell below is blank or not. If the cell below is blank, the system is then told that this is the time you have to end the loop. That means when we reach the bottom cell, it would then see if the cell below is blank. If the cell below is blank, it cancels the execution. And after this, would write LOOP, and this would then define the loop. Now within this loop, you would have to increase the cell by one offset. So this would be then the code that you would use, the one that we used before. Incrementing the cell by one because you want the cell to be moved by one. You would have to use a 0 here, by the way. And now, after this, what you need to do is you need to take that cell value and add 1 or whatever that we thought about. So to do that, you would then say cell dot OFFSET. Now you're offsetting to the right, to the column to the right. That would be 0 because you don't want an offset in rows. Yes, I believe somebody raised a hand. Oh, I should allow you to talk. Yes, yes, sir. Hey, sir, you're audible.
Simple for quality, not clear. No. Well,
Hello, Tyagarajan, sir.
actually, the screen is not clear. Actually,
Oh,
what
exactly.
command you are writing?
Oh, you mean to say it's too small?
Yeah,
Yeah.
they asked to zoom in little bit of control
Okay,
should
let me
be.
see if Zoom is there, or maybe I'll show it in another screen. I'll show it in a smaller screen. Maybe it'll work. Wait, let me reshare that. Is it better now?
No, sir. Still remains the same.
Uh-huh. I would think we have a Zoom option in the developer side. Uh, Let me think. I mean, will it be okay if I put the code snippet in the chat itself?
So is it possible to reduce the resolution of your monitor so that font will look bigger?
Okay, let me try
You can
that.
try that option there.
Okay. Guess I've done that.
Now looks good, sir.
Yeah. Now fair enough.
Okay, here, okay. Maybe
Yeah.
I have two monitors, so I'm getting confused with both. Okay, now it's fair.
Yeah. Now it's fair.
Okay,
Yeah. Thank you.
all right. All right. All right. So now to insert that value, that is the formula or the increment that we wanted to do with that value, we would then, as I said, in the Excel sheet, we would now be increasing it to the right side of the Excel sheet. So to do that, we would now write cell dot offset 0, 1. So it's an offset to the right dot value is equal to cell dot value plus 1. So what this would do is it would take the cell's value, add it by 1, and then put it to the right. You can even put whatever you want. You can maybe add it by 1, or just for fun sakes, let's put it as 50. Now let's execute this snippet and see how it performs. Executing it. Or wait, kind of think I made a mistake. I have to put this here. Sorry about that. All right. Oh, I'm sorry about this. It should have been not equal to 0. So the code should have been that while the cell's value below is not equal to 0, execute the code. So yeah, I kind of got fucked up in between. Okay, this should work. All right, now it works. All right, now let me explain the code. So the code that I've written here is if the cell value, when I iterate from A1 to the cells below. Oh, wait a second. Is my screen visible right now?
Sir, it's visible, but are you changing that cell dot offset 0, 1 is showing here? The red mark. Is that a thing or any other?
I guess there's something. Wait a second. Let me share again because I'm getting something else here. That's why. Okay. I'll share then the screen itself. I'll share this. Yeah. Now is it visible?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Now it's
Okay.
showing. Yeah.
All right. So I did make a couple of changes in between when we left off. So let me take everybody through each of the code snippet. So do while what it does is it does until this condition is met. So it does the steps that are written here until this or while this condition is met. That is the cell's value is blank, is not blank. So to basically specify not blank, what you use in Excel VBA is a lesser than and greater than. So what a lesser than and greater than operator does is to basically say not equal to. So until the cell dot or while the cell dot value is not blank, it does the operation. So I would start off with one cell. I would see if the value is not blank. So currently it's 2. And then I would then move the cursor to the right and then insert a value there, which is the value to the left plus whatever we have given here, in our case, which is 15. And then once that is done, the cell would then, or my selection would then move one cell below. And then it would once more start doing the same operation. So that's how we have defined this logic. So let me now try in running this. Go to macros, another way of running your macros. So if you go to macros, you can see all the subs that you have already defined. So let me bring that screen here. So in this screen, okay. Yeah. So in this screen, in developer tab, you can go to macros and see all the macros that you have already defined in your coding environment. So since increment is the macro that you have defined, now let's click on increment and run the code. So when you run the code, you can see that it has basically done that in a flick of a button. It has basically inserted values till the last cell. So our code is working correctly. So that's what a do while loop does. So with that said, let's now take a certain example and then understand how to perform that example. Hello, am I still audible? Hello, am I audible?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, wait a second. Let me share my screen. It's acting a bit funny. Let me ask you one question. How do I hide the this at the top? It just automatically goes. Okay. All right. So where did they stop last time? Okay. So now let's go into the next example. So the next example that we'll try to do is to delete all the blank worksheets in a certain workbook. So think that you have a workbook and you have created a bunch of worksheets and you want to delete all the worksheets that are completely blank. So let's try to code that. So I'm going to call this code as delete blank sheets. Now I'm going to define WS as a worksheet. Then I'm going to disable all the error codes in the application, which is application dot display alerts is equal to false. Then application dot screen updating is equal to false. Now to iterate through all the sheets in the active workbook, let's now call a loop. So here, the kind of loop that I'm going to use is something called for each loop. So for each, what it does is if you give a set to it, it basically gives you the ability to iterate through all the values in the set. So if the set that you're giving is say 1 to 10, it basically iterates through everything in that set. If the set is say Monday to Friday, it iterates through all the values in that set. So fundamentally, for each will iterate through whatever set that you are throwing it. So in our case, the set that we are going to give is all the worksheets in a certain workbook. So for each WS being the variable that I defined to address to each item in that set, in active workbook dot worksheets, if worksheets, if worksheet function dot count a ws dot used range is equal to 0. So if somebody would be wondering why I wrote something called worksheet function dot counting. So most of the functions that you access in the Excel environment be let's say equal to sum or equal to countif or equal to VLOOKUP and all that, most of the functions aren't natively available in your VB environment, but they can be accessed through a certain subfunction. So if a function is not already available in the VB environment, then you can call something called as worksheet function, which would then give you an ability to pick in a function from the worksheet itself. So since counta I want it from the worksheet itself, I am calling counta as a worksheet function. And then I'm supplying in all the used ranges of the worksheet. And then I'm comparing if the used range is say equal to 0. And then if it is equal to 0, then my objective is for the worksheet to be deleted or delete. And how do I end an if? By writing end if. And next WS to iterate through each item in the list of worksheets that we have here. So once this is done, let's re-enable the application's display property. So application dot display alerts equal to true. So now let's try this out. I have sheet 1 which has a bunch of value. Let's say sheet 2 I'm putting as WS, whatever. Sheet 3 I'm not putting anything. Sheet 4 I put a D. Sheet 5, sheet 6, sheet 7, sheet 8 I'm not putting anything. And sheet 9 let me put one value. Now let's see if the sheets where I do not have data in it, let's see if it's actually getting deleted. So in my case, sheet 9 should not get deleted. Sheet 8, sheet 7, sheet 6 should get deleted. Sheet 5 also should get deleted. Sheet 4, since it has a value, should not get deleted. Sheet 3 should get deleted. Sheet 2 should not get deleted. And sheet 1 should not get deleted. So this is the case that we have. And let's try running this code, which is delete blank sheet, and see if the code is actually working. So to do that, once more, you go to macros and then select the code that we have currently developed and see if it does the job or not. So let's run it. Let's see. You can see that the code has figured out where the blank sheets are and have actually knocked them off our workbook. Any questions till this point? If you can type it in the Q&A, I'll be ready to take it up. Okay. All right. Let's now write a certain code to say, take a certain cell, whatever cells that I've selected, take the values of that cell, and then convert all the values to uppercase. So let's try to write a code for that. So let's now open another sub change. Let's call this change all to uppercase. So I'm going to define RNG as range. Now I'm going to iterate through each RNG. I am going to pick each RNG or each item in the selection that I'm going to supply, which is selection.cells cells. So I'll be iterating through all the cells that I've selected. And if the cells in the selection dot has formula. So this, I don't want this to work if a formula is actually there in the cell. If a formula is there in the cell, there's no point in making it into an uppercase. Okay, there's actually a question from someone. Will you be explaining connecting or pulling data from DBs or other workbooks? All right, so pulling data from DB or other workbooks, you don't need macros for it. There's another way of doing it. So maybe I can take this right after I complete this code that I'm already doing. So right after this, I'll show you how to get into, say, a DB or a workbook and pull the data out. Yeah, we'll do that. Yeah. If rng.has formula is equal to false, then rng.value is equal to u case whatever the rng value is. Then we're going to end if, and you, okay, is here, okay. And you're going to end the for. Next. So in this code, you will go through each RNG in the selection that you've given. And with each RNG or the each cell in that selection that you're doing, you would then take the values in it, convert it to uppercase, and then paste it back into the cells that you have selected. So to do this, let's first take the same sheet, put in a bunch of values into it. Let's say, let's put in names into it. Let's put my name. Let's put Anoop. Let's put Satish. So just for simplicity's sake, I have picked up 3 names. So I'm going to select all of the 3. I'm going to macros. I'm going to run this change to all uppercase. Oh, very sorry. I have 2 n subs. Bit of, all right. So you can see that the code has now changed the values from a lowercase to the uppercase. So if people don't have any questions till this point, then let's get into this question of connecting or pulling data from DBs and other workbooks. So since this is the question, let's first of all understand where this option of pulling data from other workbooks fundamentally reside in the Excel environment. So in Excel, I am not able to hide this anymore. Why? Does it automatically hide? No. All right. So let me make it smaller. So in the Excel environment, if you go to data, which is the option in the ribbon, you would have this option of get data to your left side. So this is an area where you have an option of connecting to almost anything and getting data out of it. So if the database is the question that you have, then you'll have to click on get data. And then you would have a bunch of options, of which from database would be the option that you have to choose. And depending on the kind of database that you have, you'll have to choose from the list of what kind of database you have. Most of the cases, if say it's an Oracle database, there might be a bunch of authentication credentials and uh, login usernames and password that you need to supply to Excel to actually connect and get the data out of it. So you might have to put those credentials and then get it out. Since connecting to a database currently is not possible, because getting into a database means exposing data and all that. I won't be able to show you that, but this is the route that you'll have to take. But then connecting to database has its own tricky sides, because each database would require a very special connector. So I believe you can still connect to almost all ODBC connections if you have the credential, and if you have that secured gateway installed in your system, you'd be able to connect to most ODBC servers. Since Azure is a platform from Microsoft itself, so the Azure database, you have a plethora of ways you can connect to that. The interesting one is Power BI. So if you already have a report in Power BI, which already has data that the report is working on, then you have an option of directly connecting to Power BI by using this. This too, I won't be able to show you inside what it's pretty simple. You just click on it and choose the dashboard that you want. Then the data from the dashboard is directly pulled into the system. And if you have created a data model in Power BI, that is, in Power BI, you have tables and relationships and functions and calculations already defined, then those models will also be inherited by Excel itself. So once you connect through a pivot, you would be able to see all the data that is already there. So for simplicity's sakes, let me try to connect to a certain file and show you. So at least I can show a file that we can connect to. All right. So for simplicity's sakes, I will try to connect to a data that is already there in my laptop. This was a data that was taken for another training purpose, but the data is still there. So let me see. Yeah, this could be a good data for this. So to connect, what you would do is, this is CSV that I'm trying to connect to. So I'll click on from text and CSV. You can also get it from here. So from file, from text CSV, you can choose that option. And once you choose that option, you would then have to browse. Since I already have the address of the file, I would now be pasting the entire address and I will be typing it. So you would have navigated to the place where you have the file. So I'm going to choose sample superstore CSV file. So I'll just click on it. I'll click on import. So once I click on import, a certain time is spent on connecting to the database, which it has. Since it's a pretty small database, it won't take much time to bring it in. So you will be able to see a summary of how the data would look like. And once you're okay with the data, all you do is you either click on load or you click on transform. So the way you're pulling this in is through a layer in Excel, which is called Power Query layer. So the Power Query layer inherits itself from the Power Query that you might be familiar with in Power BI itself. So if you click on just load, the data would directly be loaded into the Excel sheet itself. But not every time you might be intending to do this. I'll tell you the reason why. Sometimes the CSV files will be too bulky, as in the data size itself will be more than 1,000,000 rows. If you are stuck with a situation of that sort, then clicking on load might not be the most smartest solution out there. Because if you click on load, the Excel will try to paste the entire data into an Excel sheet. And since the Excel sheet is limited by 1,000,000 rows, it will then load everything till that million and then forget the rest. So if you are faced with a scenario of that sort, then instead of loading, you have an option of directly going and filtering the data out. Maybe in Excel, for you to view and analyze, you might not really need the entire data set. You might need a snipe of the data, maybe a filtered version of the data, or maybe a grouped summarized version of the data, in which then you can click on transform data. The load itself has two options. One is load and another one's load to. So load, what it does is it loads the data directly into the Excel sheet. So you'll be able to see it in the Excel sheet itself. If you click on load to, there is an option to load it into a backend layer that Excel has, which acts like a database. In which case, you won't be able to see the data on your sheet, but you'll be able to access the data using using your pivot. So let's try to load the data and let's try to see how the data would then look like. Clicked on load. Yeah. So it has loaded the data, and now you can see the data in the system. Let me close it. Yeah. All right. So once you load the data, you should also know that this is very difficult to work out. You can access all this data in your Power Pivot layer. So you would have also already seen that this later data has already been loaded into the sample superstore, the sheet. So instead of loading into the sheet, or even if you have loaded it into the sheet, this also resides in the backend database of Excel itself. So if you want to say access this data and make pivots out of it, you can actually access it directly. So to do that, what you can do is you can go to pivot table and maybe just click on the pivot table itself. And yeah, okay, so this has a table in it. So what's the table name? Sample superstore. So you can just copy the table name itself and then go to insert pivot table and then put table name as sample superstore. And then you would have a pivot table made on the table itself. So the table is kind of loaded to the backend of Excel itself. So maybe, sir, if your question is answered, maybe you can kind of comment on that. Or if the panelist can unmute him somehow, then I can know if I have answered the question. All right. In the meantime, can somebody tell me how to hide the Zoom Docker? I'm not able to hide it. Anyways, let's get on with our training. Where gets to stop? Okay, oh, that's better. Now, in macros, uh, most people might be familiar with this idea of Excel macro recorder. So Excel macro recorder is a feature that you can use to basically record a keystroke or whatever that you're doing in an VB environment, and then study it from the snippet and then write your own code. The mistake that most people do is they might assume that macro recorder is the only way you can basically automate a certain task. So they would record something and then try to play the macro recorder and get their automations done. The problem with macro recorder is it records exactly what you do. It doesn't have intelligence of creating a loop and things of that sort. So say if you are stuck with a situation like, for example, you want to do a formatting in a certain way. Let's say that for number 100, let's say, I want that number to be formatted in a certain way. This ability to format, the codes that you need to format a certain cell, it many a times runs to multiple lines. So instead of you coding or Googling and figuring out how to do it, macro recorder can help you get that snippet of code. So let's maybe use that itself as an example and try to do that. So let's say in this case, I want the code to go through each number. And if that number is 100, I would like that number to be formatted in a certain way. But the format, I'm pretty sure of what the format is, but I'm not very sure of what the code to do that formatting is. Let's say if that's the situation that you're faced with, then what you can do is you can place it at a certain cell where you're trying to format it on a sample basis. Then go to developer, click on record macro. And this would then open up a inbox that says what the macro name is and all that. Let me call this as format. It really doesn't matter what the macro name is. And click on OK. And now let me format this. So let's say the format that I'm trying to give is background as yellow, text as red, maybe, and also as bold. Okay, so I've done all the formatting. I'll go to developer and I'll click on stop record. So once you do this, in your developer tab, you should be able to see a certain module created in extra. So in our case, it's called as module 2, and they've already created that module. So in this module, this is the code that the system has generated to format that area. Now, since you have this code, now you can use this code to write your own code for formatting that number, which is 100, in a set of numbers that is given. So maybe since we have already have that snippet of code for iterating from one value to the other somewhere here. Yeah, I believe this is the one that we wrote for that. Yeah. Let's use the same code. Let's reuse the code. Let's call it by another name. Let's call it as format. format C. Let's call it a format code. Okay. So I'm calling it as format C. And while iterating, this is the snippet that does the addition of 15 and all that. We would replace this and we will replace it with a formatting. But then while pasting the formatting, you should also be concerned on how it is getting applied. So we'll first copy the format, place it into module 1, and then change it in such a way that that cell is formatted. So here in this code, whatever the system has automatically generated, it is called a selection. So selection basically is the selection that you already have. That is, if you click on a certain cell, that's a selection. If you select an entire set of cells, which is called as a range, that becomes a selection. So you don't want a selection to be formatted. You want the cell to be formatted if it is of a certain value. So to do that, you would change selection. You would call cell dot interior, and then all of this, I would keep it as the same. Then here too, it's called selection. Let's change it to cell. And then here too, it's called selection.font.bold. Changing selection to cell. So this should do the formatting. This code, you don't need this code. Let's delete it. So now we need another code to be written because I want this format only to be applied if cell's value is equal to 0. So if cell dot value is equal to not 0, 100, then all of this should happen. And then we write end if. That means that is, we are ending the if statement here. All right. Now let's try and see if this works. I'm going to change the format to where how it was before. And let's see if it iterates through all the values and colors just the hundreds. Let's see. Okay, so here we go developer macros format C. Yeah, so you can see that it has done the formatting. Apparently, it has made all the values to bold, but it has changed the colors just for this. Let's figure out why it made all the cells to bold. I put the bold outside of if. That's the reason why when it iterated through all the values, it has made it to bold. So now let's put that back in to the cell and try to run it once again and see if it is all right. So let's once more paste the old format into it. And now let's run this code and see if it's working fine. Yeah, now it's working the way we want it to work. So you can maybe check in another way, maybe change this to 100 and save you once more. Run the code. You should see that 100 also gets colored. So yeah, this is how that can be done. As in, macro recorder can be used to your advantage. There's a lot more of advantages to macro recorder. Say a lot of things that you would want to do from an Excel environment if you do not know the code. Macro recorder comes in handy because whatever keystroke that you do in an Excel environment, macro recorder has a code generated for that. So you can then figure out that code and use that code into your coding and complete it. So macro recorder is there to help you in your journey. It's not a solution of automation, but it's a solution to help you understand many keystrokes in the Excel environment itself. Now, since we have reached this stage, I'll wait for another few seconds or a minute or so to see if anyone else has a question. How to package the macro and publish it for others to use. So macros, when you save a macro sheet, yeah, that brings up that. So when you save your macro sheet, when you save, let's say, I'm saving it into the address that was shown before. You should change it from XLSX to XLSM, Excel macro enabled workbook. Unless you save it as an XLSM, it really doesn't get saved. So if you do all your coding in XLSX and you save it, the next time you open it, all your codes will be lost. So the first time when you save it, change it into XLSM. Once it is saved as an XLSM, the code also gets saved. So once the code also is saved, then you can say send the files to anyone you want, and the code should work the same way in another system. So there are ways in which you can even embed a certain macro into your distribution of Word. Certain companies do that. So certain companies would develop certain macros for their in-house Excel distributions. And there are ways in which they'll push that distribution along with their standard Excel distribution, so that when their user, as in their employees, open an Excel workbook, certain things are active which another workbook might not have. So there are options of that as well, but that's too complicated. As in, there are certain security parameters that we have to bypass and all that. My laptop doesn't allow me to do that. But long story short, if you want to say develop something and send it across to someone else, save it as an XLSM instead of an XLXX, and then send that across. That workbook would also have your macros enabled in it. The another question that you might have is, you have a code in one Excel workbook. Say you wrote a code to format a certain worksheet. So this is something that we did for some of our work. So we had an Excel, a tally dump in Excel, which was formatted in a certain funny way. We wanted that to be formatted in a way that is more easy for a certain finance user to understand. And to do that, we wrote an Excel macro for that. The question is, the file that you're formatting is a different file, while the code that you have is sitting in your Excel SM. So how would that work? The answer to that is, when an Excel SM file is open and that Excel SM file has code in it, and you have the other file where the formatting needs to be done, and in your macro codes, you have called your sheet to be formatted as active workbook, then by sitting in the file where the tally dump is, you can just click on that and go to the developer tab and click on macros, and that macro tab should show you the codes that are there in the other file. So just by having the code with the active file open at one side will give you an ability to access all the codes that you have written in the XLSM file. So it is not required that the code is in the file where you are trying to format it. You just need to open the file where the code is. And as and when the file is open, you would have access to all the codes in that file from any file that is open in your system at that point in time. In fact, the cases where in certain systems, when you open an Excel workbook, certain macros are open in the background. what the IT team would have done is they would have asked the system to open a bunch of Excel macro files in the background. So technically, they're actually opening a bunch of Excel macro files in the background. That's how this access of a macro from another workbook is handled. If that has answered the question that you have, sir. Thank you, sir. So that being said, we have another half an hour. So in this half an hour, one thing that we have completely missed in the overall, the workshop that we have been doing is the ability to write a function in the macro. So to write a function, what you would do is you would open an Excel workbook. And then instead of writing sub, you would write function. And after you write function, you would then write the name of the function. The name of the function is, say, if you give equal to, then sum is the name of your function. If VLOOKUP is the name of your function. Likewise, you'll have to give a name to the function. So the function that I'm trying to create right now is a function that can pull out numbers from something where you have text and numbers in it. This function is actually pretty useful in certain cases. So what happens is sometimes when you take dumps from certain systems, the dump will come in such a way that your numbers are also some sort of combination of characters and values in it. Sometimes you might have US dollar and a number associated with it. And Excel will identify that as a character instead of a number. And because of which none of your formulas would work on top of it. So in such cases, it's pretty difficult in Excel to convert it back to a number. There are many ways to it, like column to column split and all that might help. But a good way of doing it is to define your own function that can do that. So the function that we are trying to define right now is a function that can pull out numbers from a text field or a text and number field. So if a number field has, say, or if a field has a combination of text and numbers in it, it will just pull the numbers and give it to you. That's the function that we are trying to write. It's not a completely bug-free solution, but yeah, just for understanding the idea of writing a function, this might help. So you would first write function, then get numeric. Let's say that's the function that I'm going to define. And then you open the bracket, and then you would define the kind of input that the function needs. That means, say in VLOOKUP, you would have 4 or 5 variables that it accepts. Some accepts, say, a range of values. So likewise, you will have to tell the function what is the kind of input that it wants. So in my case, I want a string to be inputted. I want a text to be inputted. So we would call, say, that as cell reference as string. Give me a moment. So as string, and the output is going to be a number. So since it needs to handle numbers that are pretty long, we would then use long as the data type. Long. And then the end of the function is always end function, which Excel automatically brings in. Then we will define string length. integer, then take the variable to itself. String length would then be length of the cell reference. And now for each character in the string, all right, now I'll explain what I've written here. So first I'm defining an integer named string length. So string length will be that variable that holds the length of my string, which is basically the cell that will refer to in the function. Once the length is got, say if the character is an Aadhaar, then 10 will come as the string length. Then I am iterating from 1 to 10. So that is why I've written for I is equal to 1 to string length, which then will become 10. And for each of that from 1 to 10, I will then iterate. And for each character in it. So this is something that everybody should be familiar with from the Excel environment itself, where you can basically pick up each character from a certain string. So I'm using mid, which is an inherited function from Excel in VBA. And I'm then picking up each character from that string. And I'm checking if it is a numeric character or not. If the character is numeric, then I'm taking a variable called result and I'm appending that result, or in Excel words, it's called what? Joining it, I guess. So I'm then joining that character with the earlier collected characters. And then once I do that loop across each character in that entire string, I would then pass out result as the value for get numeric function. And that would come as this long that we have defined here. So now the function is defined. Accessing a function is pretty different from how a traditional macro or the macro sub is referred to. So usually when you run a macro, you call a macro from the macro function here. But to call a function is pretty straightforward. All you do is you click equal to, or you press equal to, and the function that you defined is what? Get. And you start seeing the function that is there. So get numeric and let's try Govind. It should come as 0, because there's no character involved in it. Now let's try something else. Let's give it a good try. So you have numbers here. Let's say I'm putting a bunch of characters. Let's see if this kind of creates something. Okay. Now let's say my character is and I have a bunch of numbers in it. Then one bunch of characters and bunch of numbers. Let's see. This is what I'm trying to supply. Too much of characters. Yeah. So in this case, when I'm putting in characters and numbers, it would then strip out just the numbers and give it to you. Now let's look at the traditional items that you might usually get in your audit cases, where usually what could happen is you might have a case where USD and then you have a number assigned with it. Something like this you might get. Okay. So you might have a case where you have a text along with a number, and this is the kind of dump that you might get from a database. Let's say this is how it is looking like. then what you can do is you can use your function that you've defined, which is get numeric, and then select the value to the left. And once you enter, you'll see that the system has stripped out all the characters and we're getting the numbers itself. Now they've stripped it and made it as numbers. And now if you add, say, 1 to it, it'll start working like a number. So this is one way you can write a function. There are many, the ability to create your own functions opens up an entire universe of possibilities. So say you want to add certain specific months to a certain date. This might be a very peculiar problem in Excel. You'll have to write a very large formula for it. So instead of writing the large formula, you can code the entire thing in your function in the backend, and you can give a very clean function to the front. And then you can use that function to basically do all your further computations. So this is the ability that macro brings in terms of extensible function creation that you can do from the macro environment. So with this, I believe I've covered most of the basic things that someone should know from the perspective of a macro. Macro is an entire ocean in itself. So macro is some place through which you can access almost anything and everything in an Excel. In fact, things that a normal user might not be able to do, you can do it from the macro environment. For instance, say if you want to hide a sheet forever, as in you hide a sheet and you don't want any users to see it unless the macro is enabled, you can even do that. You can hide a sheet so that only very specific users can unlock it. And you code it in a macro and you put that macro to action. It is very difficult for someone to even figure out what happened to the sheet. You won't even see it when you right click and see whether there is a sheet that is hidden. It'll be hidden even from the front end interface itself. So these are the things that macros can bring to you. And because the possibilities are almost endless, covering each and every aspect of a macro in one workshop itself is almost impossible. So I believe this would be a stepping stone to the macro journey. The fundamental loops are the ones that makes macros so amazing. And since it has the control over anything and everything in Excel, there's a whole library of functions that a VBA has, which you can access from the backend. How to figure out all these functions that are available? Microsoft's documentation is the best part. So if you go online to Google and Google out Microsoft documentation for Excel VBA, it will redirect you to the Microsoft's own documentation for VBA, which is very, very detailed and precise. So by going to that portal, you'll be able to understand all the functions that are available and what you can do, what you cannot do with that function, along with examples. So how to learn it? You'll have to take up an example. So with something that you can relate to, that you are doing on a daily basis, and you feel that that is a case that you can automate, then try to pick that as a case, and then try to research yourself on how to code your macro to achieve that. And you should be able to reach the other end of it. So yeah, this is what fundamentally what an Excel VBA macro is. And I would like to answer if there are any more questions that you have at your other side.
If any of you want to unmute, you can raise your hand. We'll unmute you. Or you can leave your question in the chat also.
Ma'am, all the participants got unmuted earlier.
Okay, sir. Okay. If there are no other questions, I think we can conclude.
Madam, can we get this video?
Yes, sir. You will be able to access this video by another 3 days, which will be uploaded in our portal. In IIA Madras programs portal, we have a video link. Okay. So from there you can take, or you can take it from our YouTube page.
YouTube page. Can you get
Yeah,
the
but it may take another 3 days for us to process it, edit it, and then put it online.
okay. Now, how can we get that link? Are you mailed us? Are you mailing us?
No, we'll not be mailing it, sir.
Okay.
Yeah, you can access it from IIA Madras YouTube page or our website.
Okay. Thank you, madam.
Yes, any other question?
Deepika, is all the registrations done? All the members?
Yes, sir. Before the session, registrations were done, sir.
No, the memberships. For maybe the wrong word. Memberships. You have to tell.
Yes. So to all the IIA Madras members, IIA members, we just wish to remind that membership renewal is due to be paid before 30th April. So if any of you have not renewed membership or need to register for membership and you need any support, you can please get in touch with us. I'll leave our support number in the chat. You can directly WhatsApp or call also. And IIA registration link also I will put.
So non-members are also welcome to join.
Yes. Yes, I'm just leaving the link for registration. So yes. So basically, IIA is a professional body which provides certificate courses and provides a platform for knowledge sharing and networking. So non-members, members can renew, non-members can join as members. Yes. Any other questions on the session? Okay. If there are no questions, I would like to take this opportunity to thank Mr. Govind Nair from Deloitte for sparing his time and enlightening us today, taking from fundamentals of macros and teaching how we can scale this and how we can get updated, learn further queries, etc. Thank you for your patient handling of the session, sir, with a very naive audience. Thank you very much. We are very happy to have you among us today. Thank you, Ravi sir, and the entire IIA team for continuously organizing such useful sessions from the chapter. Good night, everyone. Nice.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.